Up next, we have Dr. Joydeep Biswas, Associate Professor in the Department of Computer Science. He is the director of the Autonomous Mobile Robotics Laboratory and is a core faculty member of Texas Robotics, where he is the Associate Director of Industry. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joydeep Biswas.
Thanks, everyone, for having me here, and thanks for the kind introduction. So I lead the lab called the Autonomous Mobile Robotics Laboratory, and so autonomy and mobility is going to be central to everything that you see today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our journey towards exploring this question of how can we have robots without boundaries? How can we tackle the unseen and novel tasks, right? So first of all, I want to set the stage about what kinds of robots we're talking about, right? So the kinds of robots that we're talking about are essentially urban service mobile robots, robots that can be deployed indoors or outdoors. These are things that you can actually ask to do assistive tasks like, hey, can you fetch me a coffee, or take this printout to the mail room, right? And a lot of our research is also applicable to commercial robots like the Amazon Astro. We've been really excited to have a long collaboration with Adam and his group at Amazon. And these techniques are also applicable to robots like the last mile delivery robots, right? So where does the state of the art lie, right? So I think it's fair to say that the present day successes with mobile robots can be summarized as thus. If a robot has a sufficiently detailed map of the world, an accurate predefined notion of its action costs, some well-defined task objective, a curated list of entities of interest, like you tell the robot, this is what you should pay attention to, right? No surprises and enough onboard sensing and compute, you can have very successful mobile robot deployments. This is a long list, and it's intentionally long. And I think everybody who's actually tried to deploy a robot will feel the pain when I come up with this list, right? So this leads me to talking a little bit about what do I mean without boundaries? Well, it's simple. Take any of these elements of the list and try to remove them. Ideally, remove all of these, right? And that's what I mean by robots without boundaries, okay? So how are we going to do this, right? So to understand how we'll do this, let's come back to what is a robot or an agent, right? A robot is basically an embodied agent. A robot does three things, not necessarily sequentially and not necessarily in this order that's given, but it does sense, plan, and act, right? But the devil lies in the details. So what's going on? So a robot is observing the world using things like LiDAR, camera, and odometry. Its sensing or perception algorithms come up with some state estimate, right? It comes up with where the robot is in the world, what the obstacles are, and so on. And the planning system comes up with some decomposed skills for the robot to do. And I really want to talk a little bit about the interface between the sensing and the planning, right? So what representations should the sensing have such that the planning can actually do something useful and informative in the real world? And how do we actually do planning without having to be actually told like exactly what the entities in the world are, right? So I'm going to focus on sense and plan, and I'm going to try to cover three themes, right? So terrain-aware navigation, mapless navigation, and object-relevant task execution, okay? So the first thing I'm going to talk about in terms of embracing the unseen is what should a robot pay attention to when navigating the world, right? And this brings me to the first topic, which is terrain-aware navigation, which is it's a large series of projects which have been jointly led by a large number of students, including Louisa Mao, Haresh Karnan, Kavan, Pranav, Sadeh, and Elvin, right? And overall, the approach that's worked really well at the high level looks like something like this, right? So we don't provide labels or classes or explicit sets of terrains for the robot to watch out for. Here's what we do. Given an input image, right, we first will do some geometric transformation to come up with a synthetic view of what the world looks like from the top down. This is what we call a synthetic bird's eye view image, or a BEV. And then we pass patches of this image through what we call this learned terrain representation function, fviz, to come up with these terrain embeddings. And these terrain embeddings are essentially signatures of what's there in the world. They're not classes, they're not necessarily labels, but they're essentially capturing some identity of what's going on in that world. And these, going from these terrain embeddings, we actually can come up with what we call the preference consistent costs, which is what would the cost of the robot driving over there be? And usually you want these to be operator aligned. So the operator has some notion of, hey, you're allowed to drive on the roads, but not the grass, right? Okay, so the real details are how do you actually come up with this function fviz? and how do you actually come up with this function JC, right? How do you come up with the terrain embedding? How do you actually come up with this cost function? So that's exactly the problem. So you have an input image, you're passing this through a function fviz, you get an embedding, right? And you have some cost function and you get a cost, right? It's worth thinking about like what are the problems here? Like what are at the lowest level, what are the problems? So the image that you get is an observation that depends on the entities in the world and the world conditions, right? And this embedding Z is some low dimensional embedding, right? So how do we actually do this? So here's one of the simplest things that you could do, which is the earliest thing that we did. Well, you could just do a demonstration. You could drive the robot around in the world and tell it, here's how to navigate around in this scenario. Now, if the robot doesn't know about these different types of terrains, this is what the demonstrations look like to the robot, right? But then the robot could hypothesize, wait a second, why is the human taking these long-winded corners, right? They could have taken a shortcut. This is rather informative. This is what we call a counterfactual, right? It's telling the robot that there is some reason the human didn't do what I thought was a shortcut, and there must be a reason why. So this is the first clue and one of the first things that we did to actually come up with this representation learning problem. We extract a patch in the shortcut which the human was actually avoiding. We take a patch from the path that the human did actually take and say that the embeddings between the two of them must be dissimilar. We don't know why they're dissimilar. We don't know what's going on in them, but they are dissimilar because clearly the human can tell a difference between them, right? So if the human can tell a difference, the robot should be able to tell a difference as well. The second piece of the puzzle here is that let's say you see the same location in the world from two different time steps. So there is a green patch over here, which is seen far out and then seen closer up. Whatever that observation of that location in the world is, it's the same location of the world, right? So if you pass it through your embedding function fviz, both of them should be in agreement, right? So these two things should be in agreement. So these two pieces of information, understanding what to separate out, what is distinct, and what is similar is really powerful for representation learning, for visual representation learning. So this is one of the first things that we did. But then we encountered a problem. And here's the problem. So I'm showing you 4 visual patches, right? Can you guess which ones of these are the same terrain type and which ones are different? Anyone want to take a wild guess? Of course, this is a trick question. So how is it tricky? They're all the same? Okay, that's a good guess. Okay, so here's the thing. The two in the middle, they're grass. This is what grass looks like in spring in Austin. This is what it looks like in the heat of summer in Austin, right? And on the left are bushes and the right are concrete. So the idea here is that just visual information alone is not necessarily enough, right? We need to understand terrains, we need something more. To understand what we need more, here's what we can actually do, right? So we take the robot's driving around in the world, and the robot can then correlate a few things, right? So first of all, 2 steps before it steps over a path in the world, it gets one observation. It moves ahead a little bit, it gets another observation of the same location in the world, and this is what we call like the viewpoint invariance again. These 2 images are of the same object, and then the robot actually drives over that thing that it was observing. When it's driving over it, we can actually recall like the inertial, proprioceptive, and tactile feedback of what it feels like to drive over it, right? And now what we do is using these 3 pieces of information, we say that they're all related. They're all the different observations of the same thing in the world, right? So when you pass them through these representation learning functions, these embeddings must be aligned in space, right? So that is actually another key piece of puzzle in the visual representation learning problem that we've been working on, right? And this turns out to be quite effective, right? When we actually visualize these representations in this embedding space, the algorithm is actually very nicely able to like separate out these different experiences, right? So this turns out to be quite effective. I have lots of videos of the robot, being deployed on trails. We love testing them on the trails around campus. On the right is some interesting some behavior. So the fact that the robot avoids the water. Okay, so let me actually back up a little bit. The robot has never seen water before, right? This is something new that it encountered. We did not actually explicitly tell it to avoid the water. Frankly, the fact that it decided that the water was high cost was actually luck. However, the thing to note over here is that it can visually distinguish the two of them, right? That is the key thing to take away. Whether it should drive over the water or not is a separate question, but the fact that it can visually distinguish it shows that our visual representation learning approach is actually working. It's actually able to distinguish these different types of terrains, right? That's a nice property that we should have. Okay. All right, so I've been talking a lot about these visual representations for these terrains, but I've actually glossed over a little bit about how do you actually make sure that you're adhering to operator preferences over these terrains, right? So what I want to do next is actually talk a little bit about operator preferences. And in particular, I want to take a hard version of the problem, which is that an operator happens to change their mind about terrain preferences. Either it's because you're running a different mission or it's a different person, but they could be different preferences, right? What do I mean by that? So imagine you have the scene where this robot here is starting from here and it's trying to get there. One preference could be that you prefer the brick over the grass, in which case you should take this long path, right? If you prefer the grass over the brick, you should just take a shortcut here, right? Why is this a problem? The reason why this is a problem is that most preference learning approaches, when you change these preferences, you have to retrain your model. You have to redo everything from scratch, right? What you need is a way to rapidly adapt your preferences without having to do this training. So 2 problems here. First of all, how do you convey your preferences to the system? And secondly, how does it rapidly adapt to your preferences? Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about how we did this first part. How do we express our preferences to the system? So here's how we express our preferences to the system. This is an approach which we called PACER, Preference Conditioned All-Terrain Cost Map Generation. There's an input image, okay? And in that input image, the human actually clicks on points in the image and says, I prefer this location to that. I prefer this location to that. I prefer this location to that. And that's what this shows over here. It shows patches where the human says, I prefer the thing on the left to the thing on the right, okay? This is what we call a preference context, right? It's not a fully comprehensive annotation of what the human prefers, but it's a small snapshot of what they're implying, right? Now, given this small preference context, the system actually generates what we call a cost map, which is where are the high costs and the low costs. And you see these nice patterns emerge where if you invert the preferences, so if brick is better than grass, then the brick region has low cost. It's darker in the cost map image. If you invert it, then the brick gets higher cost, which means that it becomes more white than the grass, right? So you see this adaptation. So this is actually one of the first approach, probably the first approach to actually do runtime adaptation to preferences without any retraining, right? And actually introduces notion of the preference context. How do you actually take into account partial preferences? So architecturally, what we did is that we had a preference context encoder, we had this image encoder, and then we had decoded out directly to the cost maps, right? So that's essentially the idea over here. So in the interest of time, I won't be able to go into details about how we trained it, but this is essentially one of our most promising approaches for deploying these systems in the world without having to put labels onto them. When the operator clicks and says, like, this is preferable to that, they don't need to say, this is grass or this is brick. It's for whatever reason they prefer one to the other, and they're able to convey that to the system, right? And what's cool is that we've deployed this approach in scenarios where the images were out of distribution as well, such as we gave them infrared images, and we're able to adapt to that as well. So we're seeing these out of distribution, unseen behaviors, which are really, really powerful. I can give you a few examples of this in action. So 2 environments, left and right, and 2 different preferences, top and bottom. In the top one, it's being told to prefer the sidewalk over the grass. So you can see it takes a longer route here. It takes a longer route here. In the bottom, it's being told that grass is better. So it actually makes a beeline through, and it takes like a diagonal across, right? So this is some way, some evidence that it's actually generalizing to these different preferences. Okay. So I've been talking a lot about these terrain preferences, right? But I want to switch a little bit to talking about this more general problem, which I will call mapless navigation, right? When you're in a city, right? So if you're in a new urban environment, there's more to just terrains that you have to worry about, right? So if you have not been in a location, you encounter situations on the fly, and you have to figure out how to deal with them. Things like elevated walkways, you have to be careful not to fall off the part without the railing. If there are crosswalks, that's where you should cross the road. If there's foliage obstruction, you should reason about, is there a sidewalk under it or not, right? And then when there's curb ramps, you have to be careful about not getting tripped over by these curb ramps and so on. Now the thing is that there is a very large set, a possibly open set of these relevant entities. It's infeasible for you to tell the robot all of the things to pay attention to, right? And there's going to be many variations of this, right? The canonical problem with these robot data sets is that during development, there are some entities that you encounter, and there are some environmental conditions that you encounter. In deployment, they could be quite different, right? Ideally, if you have overlap of all of them, that's golden, but that never ever turns out to be the case. So how can you actually overcome this problem? So the idea that we had is that can you somehow leverage large pre-trained models to aid in this transfer? And this is actually quite a powerful approach. So there are models, visual models, which actually extract representation similar to what I was talking about earlier, but they're not just about terrains. They're about semantic understanding of arbitrary entities in the world, right? And these are trained with internet scale data, right? So what does internet scale data actually bring? What does big data bring? What it brings is invariance to world conditions. So let's say you're observing an entity E1 with world condition W and W prime. The encoding of the two should be the same for all different world conditions W and W prime. And we also get the semantic similarity. If you have two different entities which are semantically similar, the embedding of these should be similar, right? So these essentially generalizations are what these big pre-trained models are good for, and that's essentially an approach that we tried out, right? And that led to this work called CREST, which we presented at RSS last year, right? It was led by, the lead student was Arthur Zhang, who's a PhD student in my lab. And the idea here is that we do what we call alignment via distillation. So there's internet scale image data, right? And we provide a small number of unsupervised robot data to actually distill these models. So how do we do this, right? So we know a thing or two about navigation. We know what works and what doesn't work, right? So what we say is that from the pre-trained visual foundation models to navigation features, we separate out things like the static parts of the environment. We separate out the dynamic parts of the environment because we know for navigation, these things are relevant and they're separate, right? So we come up with a very structured way to represent this information in the world, and that's what we call this perceptual encoder, right? There's a lot of details about how we actually distill these models, but in the interest of time, I'm going to have to skip that, and you can come back to me afterwards and we can talk a little bit about this. I want to talk a little bit about how we come up with this cost function in the world, right? The problem with these demonstrations, again, like going back to the first area that we had, demonstrations, you demonstrate to the robot how to take this curb ramp, right? And what the expert is doing is that they're very carefully avoiding these raised curbs, right? But if you see the demonstration is mostly driving in a straight line, there is no explicit information here that the human is avoiding it. With this information during deployment, it's very easy to, it's very common that these robots will clip corners, and this is the kind of failures that we see. And this is what leads to like the robot overturning in the world and like things really going wrong, right? What we really would like to have is a negative demonstration. The robot, the human operating the robot and saying, this is what you should not do, right? But this is a very difficult thing to get. It's very dangerous, right? So how can you actually do this? This is where counterfactual demonstrations come into play. So what the robot does is that it generates hypothesized alternate trajectories, right? This is not what the human came up with. This is what the robot thinks are equally good as far as it can tell. And then it asks the human, hey, to me, all of these trajectories look equally good. Are they equally good to you? And the human can say, yes, 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 no, 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 right? This is a really powerful counterfactual demonstration. This is kind of like the first approach which I showed, but kind of really scaled up to be much more informative. And this is really powerful. It actually works, right? So I'm going to skip this loop in the interest of time. But again, going to some results, using only 3 hours of demonstrations, we deployed the system on a real robot. We're able to see lots of interesting behaviors. We can actually navigate in these settings with these open sides. We can actually take sidewalks and cross at crosswalks. It can actually be robust to foliage covering and so on, right? We also did a large-scale deployment where we ran this robot in Mueller. And just to play a short clip, this is the robot, following the sidewalk. It has access to GPS, but GPS is not accurate enough. The robot's actually looking at what's in front of it to understand how to move around in the world. So this is really exciting to me because for the first time, we're actually able to deploy robots in the urban scale without giving them a pre-curated map of the world. No HD maps, no being told exactly what to pay attention to, right? So that's really exciting to me, okay? I'm going to raise a question now, right? And I want you to think about this a little bit. Is it possible to perceive relevant entities of relevance to robot navigation in order of one time? Sorry for the typo there. But the idea here is that we have this notion of robots being able to perceive the world and act on it for the same time, every time step. Is that really a realistic expectation? And I think we're starting to believe the answer is no. For the most common cases, you should be able to do that. But when you're encountering a difficult case, you actually have to stop and think a little bit, right? Which is leading us to think a little bit about what does deliberative reasoning mean for navigation, right? So this is an open question. We have some ongoing work about this. Come talk to me about this afterwards, and I can talk a little bit about it. In the last few minutes, I just want to quickly talk a little bit about some object-relevant task execution that we can work with, right? So this is the thing about tackling novel objects. How can a robot recognize task-relevant objects, right? So the task here looks like this. So let's say you have an unstructured history of the robot moving around in the world, right? You're in a long-term changing environment. This project is actually led by Taijing Chen, who's a PhD student, and co-advised by Roberto and me, right? And the idea here is that the user wants to tell the robot, bring me a book that was on the study desk yesterday. So they're referring to objects, and they're referring to them in open-ended manners. And the robot does not know what the user is going to ask of them. It could be anything in the environment, right? So how would a user do? How would a human actually do this? The human would actually think a little bit about, well, what was the book on the desk yesterday? Oh, okay, so this is the book I saw on the desk yesterday. Where did I see it afterwards? Oh, okay, I saw it on the shelf there. I saw it on the table over here. The last location that I saw that book was on the shelf. Maybe I should go and check whether it's still there. If it's not there, then I can check in some of those other locations. So this kind of reasoning that the robot's doing about what are you referring to, where have I seen it before, where should I check, is really the what we actually wanted to do. And that's actually an algorithm that we came up with. It's called searching in space and time. And essentially the idea here is that we don't make a distinction about checking in memory and checking in space. It's all about reasoning about time and space, right? And the robot can actually choose which ones to actually call upon to do these different tasks, okay? So this is just a quick snapshot. I know it's a lot, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of the different ways in which we're thinking a little bit about robots without boundaries. I just want to finally conclude and say that it's actually a coordinated endeavor. There's no way we could have done this without actually closing the loop and actively deploying these robots in the real world. You necessarily have to test these. You necessarily have to discover the open problems, and you can't do it without deployments, right? So this concludes my small glimpse of robots without boundaries, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you for the talk. Could you explain more about how you did the counterfactual negatives?
Yeah. So, okay. So I have a slide about it. I can just briefly go over it. Okay. So the way this works is that we take in expert demonstrations and we run a classical inverse reinforcement learning algorithm, which provides a cost function, and then we go back to a validation data set and actually check for divergence from the expert. When there's a divergence from the expert, the robot actively queries the human. This is actually an active querying loop, right? And the robot says, these are the alternate trajectories I thought of, which were equally good. And it randomly samples for that, right? And then it asks the user gives some negative demonstrations, it updates the process, and then this keeps going until convergence, okay? So that's in a nutshell. You can see the paper for full mathematical formulation details, okay? Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much for presenting. Very cool work. Yeah, so you talked a lot about snapshotting static images of terrain, and sometimes it proceeds in kind of a state fashion. It looks one state ahead. But how do you address dynamic data like crossing road, right, passing cars, or even right, if, on the sidewalk, there's other humans walking in front of it, behind it. By the time it makes a decision, is it already too late? Is it the path?
Yeah, so that's a great question. This is actually explicitly why we actually reason about having different layers in our embedding for static and dynamic parts of the environment. We don't explicitly track the dynamics in the world, but the fact that we have layers and embedding devoted to these dynamic features is a reason why we did this, and we hope that it picks up these costs related to these dynamic entities. We actually did do some ablations to see whether this was actually picking up informative features about that, and the answer is yes, it does pick up the differences between if you didn't do this separation and you just treated the entire world as a whole. Thanks. Yes.
I got one. Oh, good. There we go.
Sure.
So I'm looking at the robot operator preference,
Yes.
sort of without retraining. And so I'm looking at a lot of data set collection and supervised trainings that people are doing.
Yeah.
And thinking that, people spend an inordinate amount of money. I work in humanoids,
Yeah.
so huge amounts of money
Yep.
training, and then they find, oh, well, when I deployed it in someone's house, let's say, it's making the tea all wrong.
Yeah.
Everything's wrong. It's,
That's right.
it's putting the leaves in after the water or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering about the extensibility of this approach and if it can go directly into that kind of training model and say, okay, you've trained a bunch of good stuff, but your ordering's incorrect.
Okay.
Or a bunch of good stuff and it's useful, but not really quite correct.
Great question. So we actually have a very detailed data augmentation pipeline for dealing with issues like this. So the first thing that we do, and I didn't have time to talk about this, is that we take these demonstrations, and these demonstrations have partial orderings between them for a realistic human. And what we do is we sample full demonstrations between them, and this becomes a base data set, right? So the sample set of the demonstrations. And then we do something rather crazy. We say that, remember that this is actually talking about paying attention to the operator's preferences, right? Then we pretend that in this data set, what if their preferences were shuffled? What would happen? To create this data set, we actually have to label objects in the environment, and I have to say, oh, if the operator preferred this over that, the cost of that should be less than this, right? So we shuffle the preferences synthetically, and we come up with a lot more data to pay attention to the preferences. And the third thing that we do is even more crazy, which is that we take a real image and we replace stuff in that with synthetic textures, right? And that gives us a lot more demonstrations, a lot more robustness. So we have to do a lot of these crazy shuffling and counterfactuals and all to get the kind of robustness that you're talking about. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much. So my company, we have this robot. It's called Temi, and it has this LiDAR that it uses to move around this hotel lobby. And oftentimes I see this LiDAR work. It works really well, but then there's glare coming off the ground, and it just starts freaking out.
Yep.
And so the question that comes to mind is, how do you manage or handle imperfect sensor data in your robot's movement?
Thanks. We should talk after this. But there's a whole line of projects in my lab which I didn't have time to talk about. The thesis of Sadeh Rabi, who is actually an engineer at Amazon now, was on introspective perception, which is asking what parts of your data are likely to lead to failures, or should I not trust, right? And this was inspired by things like that. We were doing visual inertial odometry outdoors, and lens flares would throw it off, right? Or we had there was an amusing video which we have, which I don't have now, where the robot would see its own shadow on the ground, and the shadow in the image is not moving, and it would be fooled into believing that it's not moving, right? So there are all of these interesting ways of perception failing, and really the way to think about it is that there'll always be perception failures. You can't overcome them. Can you at least hypothesize what elements of your observations lead to these failures, and can you actually plan around them, right? So that's the core idea that we've been taking for things like that. Okay.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. Okay, so during the amazing discussion, you mentioned interfacing with the model and having these interactions and distinctions that you want to lay out and change or mutate. Is that something that you find is integral to the process? So there'd be an interface layer and then the robot interpretation layer? Or do you think it's more in the training element
That's a great question. So I think that having a representation which is visualizable and can be deployed to the operator is good, not just for roboticists, but also what I will call domain experts who are not necessarily roboticists, but they're experts in their domains. So having some visualization that they can look at and understand this is why the robot's doing what it's doing is very, very powerful. So some of our work is funded by Army Research Laboratories, and they have folks out in the field who aren't roboticists, but they would like to have some understanding of the reason why it's choosing this path is because this path is visually similar to this other thing, and that thought was low cost. Having a completely black box system is unnerving to most people, right? So these representations are really powerful for that as well.